Today we're going to be in John chapter 12. Last week we talked about the death principle, and we talked about how to truly live we must risk, we must sacrifice, and we must die. And when I say die, that might mean actually giving up your life, but probably more for most of us, it's dying to things like self, my wants, my desires, my rights. And we talked about sacrificing comforts, my ease, my comforts, my security. We talked about giving up all of those things for the sake of Christ. And we ended the whole thing with the question, do I love God more than the life he gave me? And I think we really need to think that through and decide whether or not we love him enough to give up everything that he's given us. Today in John chapter 12, our message is titled Confess. And I don't mean confess like, the judge is asking you to confess all of your crimes or confess that you murdered that guy. I don't mean confess like that. I mean confess more in a positive sense, like confessing the truth. So confessing what you know to be true. We'll get to that in a little bit, but before we do that, I need to set the stage, make sure we're all on the same page. And that means I got to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And we at Denslow Community Church believe that God created everything that we see as existing out of nothing. That includes the earth, that includes plants, animals, and that includes us as humans. And we believe that God created us as humans to have fellowship with him. Not that he needed us or that he was bored or that he was lonely, but that he created us for a relationship with him and relationship with one another. And we believe that in the garden, when God created Adam and Eve, they had perfect fellowship with him. They had the ultimate relationship with God. In fact, it was so pure and so right that they didn't even have clothes on. It was just so perfect. And that's kind of weird to think about. But that's how pure it was in that time. And God gave them the ability to choose right and wrong, and he gave them the ability to choose certain things. And God said, you can eat of everything in the garden. Imagine all of perfect fruit and all of perfect vegetables at your disposal. But God says you can't have that one fruit there. And of course, being human, they thought, well, that's the one I need. And so they got that fruit. They ate of that fruit. The one thing that God said, don't do, they did. Enter sin. Sin then comes into the world, causes absolute chaos. All of the problems that we suffer now are related to that original sin and our sin. Jesse's condition in the hospital is sin, not his, but just sin in the world, creating the bodies that just fall apart. We were not designed to fall apart. We were designed to live in perfect fellowship with God forever. So now we've got sin entering into the world. Sometime later, God, by the way, in Acts chapter 7, which is in your New Testament, there's this really cool 50-verse narrative of everything I'm going over. When Stephen was about to get stoned, he did this 50-verse history of the church thing. It's a lot better than what I'm doing and a lot more accurate too. But along the way, God chose this guy named Abraham to be the bearer of God's promise. And that is that he would give Abraham blessings. He would bless Abraham. He would give Abraham a great nation. He would give Abraham a great name. And he would bless all of the world through Abraham. And then Abraham birthed Israel, the people we know as the Jewish people, the Israelites. And they lived under that promise. They were God's chosen people. And they looked forward to the day that the Messiah would come and right all that was wrong. Enter Jesus. Many centuries after Abraham's promise, Jesus comes on the scene as that Messiah, the long-awaited one that they've been waiting for. And see, because of that whole sin thing, right, we could not have fellowship with God. But because of what Jesus did and us looking back in hindsight, we know that Jesus died to give us that relationship back. But as we go through this story of Jesus in John, the people that he's first to minister to are the Jewish people, the people of the promise. And they're not getting it. And we're going to see that in John chapter 12. So John chapter 12 and verse 27. John chapter 12, verse 27, right there. Now is my soul troubled, Jesus speaking, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The crowd that stood there and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So the crowd answered him, we have heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. How can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? So who is this Son of Man? So Jesus said to them, the light is among you for a little while longer. While you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. The one who walks in the darkness does not know where he is going. While you have the light, believe in the light that you may become sons of light. When Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe in him, so that the words spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. So Isaiah is a prophet to the people of Israel back in the Old Testament, and he says these words about those people of the promise. Lord, who has believed what he heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore, they could not believe. For again, Isaiah said, he has blinded their eyes and has hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Isaiah said these things because he saw his glory and spoke of him. Nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him. But for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. And Jesus cried out and said, whoever believes in me believes not in me, but in him who sent me. And whoever sees me sees him who sent me. I have come into the world as light, so that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. If anyone hears my words and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come into the world to judge the world, but to save the world. The one who rejects me and does not receive my words has a judge. The word I have spoken will judge him on the last day. For I have not spoken on my own authority, but the Father who sent me has himself given me a commandment, what to say and what to speak. And I know that his commandment is eternal life. What I say, therefore, I say as the Father has told me. So the people that Jesus is speaking to, the Jewish people that are around him, all would say they believe in God, the Father, right? And now Jesus is saying, when I say the things I say, I'm saying what the Father tells me to say. And he's telling them to believe in him, and that means they believe in the Father. So he's made this real tie between what they believe already and what he's trying to tell them. But ironically, it says that they do not believe. In verse 37, it talks about how they have been hardened. Verse 37 says, though he had done many signs before them, they still did not believe him. So just a moment ago, God, the Father, spoke from heaven to Jesus in their hearing, and they don't believe, right? Just moments ago, they heard it. So there's all of these witnesses about who Jesus is, his own signs, and then the Father from heaven speaking, but they don't yet believe. And in verse 39, it says, therefore they could not believe. Therefore they could not believe. And it goes on to say that their hearts were hardened. The they there isn't all of Jewish people, even in that time. Not all of Jewish people would fall into that they who were hardened and could not believe, because all of Jesus' initial followers were Jewish, right? All of his initial followers were people of the Jewish nationality and Jewish religion who saw the truth in who Jesus was. So the they is kind of a broad brush. For the most part, the nation of Israel did not believe. And more importantly, the they, again, in a broad stroke, is the religious leaders of the day, the Jewish religious leaders who were hardened and did not believe. Even though he did many, many miraculous signs. Look again at verse 36. It says, the last half of that verse says, when Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe. That's John's commentary. John, our author here, commentary on why Jesus is going away. because they did not believe, because they didn't understand, Jesus goes away, right? He had just given them a bunch of signs. God had just spoken. They do not believe. And then he goes away and he hides himself from them. Now, Jesus, we've talked about it before. Not long ago, Jesus left and departed from them because they were trying to kill him. He left and got away from them. So Jesus has left many times to not be where the religious leaders of the day might kill him. This is the only time I can think of where it says that Jesus went away and hid. Jesus literally hid from them. That brings us to our first point. We can ignore God only so long. We can ignore God only so long. Jesus, God in the flesh, and he's testifying to that in these words, he's there speaking to his people as the Messiah. He's speaking to them, and they don't get it. They don't understand. Their hearts are hardened. In a sense, they are ignoring him. And then Jesus hides himself from them. The religious leaders of the day are so dead set against him that Jesus goes and he hides himself from them. And the point is, we can ignore God only so long. And the second point, if we persist in ignoring him, God will honor our desire to be distant. See, they didn't really want Jesus around. They were going to try to kill him. So Jesus leaves their presence and goes away. So he honored their desire to not have them around. He went and he hid himself. There's a story in Luke chapter 15. You don't need to turn there, but I'm going to, and I'm going to read it to you. It's this. Most of us know it. We call it the parable of the prodigal son. Verse 11 of Luke 15 says, "And he said," that would be Jesus. Jesus is he. "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate. No one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread? But I perish with hunger. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against you and against heaven and before you.'" Sorry, I'm making it all up as I go. Verse 19. "I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants.' And he arose and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But his father said to his servants, 'Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate." So we all kind of know that this parable is about our relationship with God, and that we, the prodigal son, have wandered away from God, and that he's waiting with open arms for us to return. And as we return, he runs to us, and we see this picture of God and us, right? Well, the point that I want us to get is that the father let the kid go. The kid wanted to leave, and the father said, "Here's your money, go." That's what God does with us. If we want to ignore him, he will let us go. He will let us experience the distance from him that we desire. Sometimes we don't want to be around him, and so we wander away, and he will let us go. If we persist in ignoring him, he will honor our desire to be distant. The second point there is God will stop speaking to us. If we persist in ignoring him, he will stop speaking to us. This is possibly the last time that Jesus speaks to the religious leaders until his quote-unquote trial. He's no longer teaching them. He's no longer trying to get their attention. He's done with them. And he's just going to, as they arrest him, he will respond to them at the trial. But he has stopped speaking. And this happens over and over and over as we look through the Old Testament. As you read Kings and Chronicles, you see that the nation would ignore God over and over. One of the kings, a kid named Josiah, when he became king, he was 7 years old or something like that. He became king, and they started to do some reforms, and they were actually cleaning out the temple, and they found the book of the law, which is probably the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It was the thing that the priests would read to the people. They found it. It had been lost. At some point, the people of Israel had put up all of these other gods in their temples and were worshiping all these other gods besides the one true God, to the point where they decided, oh, we don't need that book of the law anymore. We've got all this other stuff. And so God had not been speaking to them for years. And they had not been seeking him. And God honored their desire to be distant and stopped speaking to them. When Jesus shows up on the scene in first century Palestine, the Jewish people have not heard from God in hundreds of years. He has been distant from them. They've wanted to ignore him, and he's honored their desire to be distant, and he's stopped speaking. And he will do that for us too. If we ignore his commands, if we ignore his promptings, if we ignore his voice, he will eventually stop speaking. I mean, you can imagine, right? After the 30th time he tells you to do something, and you're like, he's going to just say, all right, well, you're not going to, so I'm just going to stop asking. If we persist in ignoring him, he will honor our desire to be distant. He will stop speaking to us. And the third thing, he will let us make an absolute mess. We see that again in the people of Israel. We see that in the story of the prodigal son. The father lets the kid go. He goes and he does exactly what he wants to do, and he ends up sleeping with pigs, which, by the way, for a young Jewish boy, is the worst thing that you can do, because pigs are unclean. You can't even eat them, let alone hang out with them, right? And so now he's feeding them. He's feeding them, right? We think the pigs should feed us. He's feeding them, and he's longing to just eat the garbage that they get to eat. He's made an absolute mess out of his life. God will let us. If we persist in ignoring him, he will let us make an absolute mess out of our lives. I can testify to that personally. Before any of you knew me, I had made an absolute mess out of my life. And because I was ignoring God, doing my own thing. And I made an absolute mess. The good news is, bad news, if we persist in ignoring him, he will honor our desire to be distant. He will stop speaking to us. He will let us make an absolute mess out of our lives. But if we persist in ignoring him, he will use extreme means to get our attention. He will use, I call it the holy 2x4. If we wander away far enough, long enough, eventually he will stop speaking to us and stop warning us, and he will just smack us upside the head with a board to get our attention. That may come in lots of different forms, but he will do it. He will get our attention because he wants us with him. He loves us. The young boy in the prodigal son story, he gets his attention when he wakes up one day and he realizes that what his father has to offer is far better. He has fallen to the absolute utter depths, laying in pig slop, sleeping with the pigs at the very bottom of earthly existence, realizing that, wow, back home it's far better. In Psalm 119, you don't need to turn there. You can if you want to, but the references are in your notes if you want to look at it later. Psalm 119, verse 67, the psalmist, whoever wrote this psalm, says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word." So before he suffered the holy 2x4, he went off on his own way. But now, after the affliction, he's keeping God's word. And he says later in verse 71, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." And he says again, now in verse 75, "I know, O Lord, that your rules are righteous, and in faithfulness you afflicted me." So the psalmist here, recognizing that the holy 2x4 came from God. And he recognizes that it was God who afflicted him. And he recognizes that the affliction, the 2x4, was good because it brought him back to what he needed to be. So if we persist in ignoring God, he will honor our desire to be distant. He will stop speaking to us. He will allow us to make an absolute mess, and then he will smack us upside the head and bring us back to him if he can get our attention with the 2x4. I kind of think he will. It's just how much pain you want to suffer before you turn around. How many times he has to hit you. Point 2, a time will come when we can no longer respond to Jesus. So back in John 12 in our story, we see that Jesus, God in the flesh, has come to speak as Messiah to the people, and they are not hearing him. He says in verse 35, "The light is among you for a little while longer. While you have the light, lest darkness overtake you. The one who walks in darkness does not know where he's going. While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become sons of light." Jesus is saying to them, I'm going to be here for just a little while longer. You're going to have the light for just a little while longer. You need to believe in the light while it's here. So Jesus is telling those people in that moment, now is your opportunity to believe. Now is the time for you to believe. Similarly, for us, Jesus is saying to the people of Israel, the window of opportunity for you to believe in me is about to close. So you need to get busy and believe. Similarly, for us, the window of opportunity for us does not always stay open. Sometimes the window will close on us, and we will no longer have the opportunity to believe. We see that in Luke 16. The window will close at the time of your death. You will not have the opportunity after that to believe. In Luke chapter 16, there's a story, again, Jesus telling a story about the rich man and Lazarus. And again, you don't need to turn there. I'll just read it. Luke 16 and verse 19 says, "There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate laid a poor man named Lazarus." This is not the same Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead. This is a different Lazarus. Apparently, it's a relatively common name. "And at the gate laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, hell, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame.' But Abraham said, 'Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us.' And he said, 'Then I beg you, Father, to send to my father's house. For I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them.'" So he wants him to send Lazarus, right, to his father's house so that he can warn his brothers, "lest they also come to this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." And the guy says, "They'll believe if somebody raises for the dead." And Abraham says, "No, they won't." And they didn't, right? When Jesus raised from the dead, many still didn't believe. Here's the point I want us to get, though, from this story, is that the rich man died, wanted a second chance. Abraham makes it clear he can't have it. There is no second chance. So the window of opportunity to believe in Jesus will definitely close at your death. The second one, the window may close with the change of circumstances. See, you may be in a place right now where you've got this coworker that's a Jesus freak and is sharing Jesus with you all the time. You may be in a place where you're being maybe inundated with Bible stuff and Jesus and the opportunity to believe, but you might lose that job might change, the coworker might leave, the circumstances might change, and then you're not hearing the word anymore. And time will pass, and unless somebody else comes into your life and starts sharing stuff with you, you forget about all the things that person said or may have said, and then pretty soon you forget all about it, And the window of opportunity has closed because your circumstances have changed and that opportunity doesn't exist anymore. The last thing is the window may just simply close. In Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, the writer of Hebrews quotes Psalm 95. And in Psalm 95, it says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. The writer of Hebrews quotes that 3 times in those 2 chapters. And the implication of the passages is this, that while you hear his voice, accept it, because the time will come when you won't be hearing it. It seems like the writer of Hebrews and even the writer of Psalms is saying today, when you hear his voice, respond. Because you may not hear it again. There's this implication that that window of opportunity could close on you. So it's possible that the window of opportunity may close. You may not get the opportunity to hear again. Okay? So we need to, when we hear his voice, we need to respond. Third and final point. Unconfessed belief is the same as unbelief. Unconfessed belief is the same as unbelief. And here's where we get that. Look at verse 42 in John again, John chapter 12 and verse 42. Jesus is among his people, and he's Messiah, and he's speaking to them, right? And it says that this blanket Israel, they have not believed. But in verse 42, nevertheless, many, even of the authorities, believed in him. So it says, even though the vast majority of people did not believe in Jesus, in verse 42 it says, well, even among the leaders, there were people that believed. But then there's this terrible word, but. But for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. So there was this fear that they would be kicked out of the synagogues, and therefore they did not confess what they believed. And the first thing that pops into my mind is Romans 9, 10, 9 and 10. Romans 10, 9 and 10. And it gives us a prescription for salvation. Verse 9 of chapter 10 of Romans says, because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. Same word there, confess. It's homologeo, which means same word. So really all Jesus is saying is that you need to agree. And what our passage tells us is that there were people among the Jewish leadership that refused to confess openly their belief in Jesus. And when I read Romans 10, 9, and 10, that makes me think that if they had a belief, but they didn't confess it openly, then that's the same as unbelief. So unconfessed belief is the same as unbelief because it is with our mouths that we confess and are saved, according to Romans. But if we just believe in our heart and we don't confess it openly, then the possibility exists that we have not actually been saved. And these guys feared being kicked out of the synagogue. And they go to Matthew chapter 10. We're going to read something together. So flip over to Matthew chapter 10. It says, John says that the people of Jesus' time, these leaders that wouldn't confess openly, were more concerned with the glory or renown that people would give them than in the glory of God. They were more interested in accolades from their fellow man than they were in bringing God glory or the glory that comes from following God. So they gave up eternal salvation because of their fear of their fellow man and their desire to have renown among their fellow man. Because, as some of you know, it's not the most popular thing to declare Jesus out loud. Especially in Jesus' day. They were going to get kicked out of church forever if they declared Jesus as Messiah. We can have that same problem. We can stand up for what we believe and people will ridicule us. And if we don't stand up for what we believe, then we won't get ridiculed. And if we're a new believer and we stand up to confess, but people ridicule us and then we don't confess, I fear Romans 10:9 and 10, that we have not confessed and we will not be saved. Look at Matthew chapter 10. Matthew chapter 10, verse 32 says, "So whoever acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven." So it's the same kind of idea of confessing. Whoever confesses me before men, I will also confess before my Father. Jesus goes on to say the negative, "But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven." So we can look at that and go, well, for Pete's sake, I haven't denied Jesus. I just haven't said anything about him. Oddly, the word for deny there can mean just flat out deny, but it means refuse to affirm, refuse to confess. So in that moment when I refuse to confess my belief in Jesus, then Jesus is saying, well, I'll refuse to confess you before my Father. And these people in John chapter 10 refused to confess Jesus. They denied it. They refused to confess their belief. They had the ability to see the truth, but they weren't willing to face the negative ramifications of stating that belief. So we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to give us an opportunity. Because I firmly believe that unconfessed belief is the same as unbelief. There might be some of us, many of us, have confessed that belief. We've been baptized. There are people in this room that were baptized as part of this church. In fact, all 4 of you are here. Very cool. We had baptisms when we first got going as a church, and so 4 people that are in this group declared openly that they were Jesus followers and wanted to follow Jesus and show it openly. We did it at a park. It's pretty open. We're not going to go get baptized today, though we could do it in the parking lot. There's a puddle out there just about big enough. I saw Evelyn disappear into it earlier on her way out. We're not going to do baptisms today, but there's a couple things that I'm going to give you the opportunity to do. You may just want to talk to somebody about this whole idea. And so as we close our worship, even after we're done with worship, we're not going to run off and have a barbecue. So there will be time. If you have questions, just come and talk. Come and ask me. Come and ask John. Come and just ask those questions. If, however, you at this moment realize that you believe, but you've never confessed Jesus, you've never said openly, I am a follower of Jesus, I believe, and you want to do that, I'm going to give you that opportunity too. So as we close in worship, if you want to confess that you are that person and you are openly confessing that before us, then just come on down. And by your coming down during worship, you will be showing us that is your desire.